So I recorded this earlier today and my iPad died while I was doing it. So now I'm recording it one more time. So we're starting in chapter 20 of Numbers. And for verse 8, 11, and 12, I grouped those together. And I wrote down things that I learned from my pastor a couple of years ago from a message. And a little bit of it is my own. So I said, Moses was told to speak to the rock, and he didn't do that. If you read, he strikes the rock twice, actually. So he disobeyed God. And we all know that disobedience, which is sin leads to death. That's said in Romans 6 and 16. And the part that we don't really think about whenever he does that is that he breaks the typology of Jesus being the rock. And so throughout the Bible, you'll see examples of Jesus being the rock. And when Jesus didn't have to die on the cross twice. He only had to do it one time. So when he hits the rock twice, he breaks that typology. And so this was trying to show that the rock, which is Jesus, is a source of water. So living water, like he told the woman at the well. And he basically broke the type of Jesus being a rock. So that is a huge deal, like a very big deal. And then in between those verses, there's 9 and 10. And this is actually from my boyfriend's brother whenever he did a lesson for our campus ministry. And verse 10 says, "Here, this is Moses speaking. Hear now, ye rebels. Must we fetch you water out of this rock?" And then I wrote down, notice how Moses says we. So I didn't even realize this ever until he started talking about it, but Moses says we. And that's a big deal because Moses didn't fetch them water. It was all God. Like if Moses just spoke to the rock, nothing would have happened. But because he spoke to the rock, because God told him to, water, well, he didn't speak to the rock, but if he were to have spoken to the rock and water came out, it would have been from God. So he's basically taking credit for a portion of what God did. And he was getting a little arrogant. And my theory kind of is that probably is what led him to disobey. Like I think he was getting a little big-headed. And I know that it says Moses was really humble throughout most of the thing. It'll talk about it a lot, but I think this is probably the point. Like this is right before he dies, not right before, but this is before he dies. And I think that he was getting a little big-headed, and that's why he disobeyed, because you never really see anywhere else that he's disobeying. But whenever he starts saying things like, must we fetch you water, then he disobeys. So that's what I'm highlighting in the video right now. And then, well, actually I'm highlighting the thing I said before. Ignore me. And then the next thing I highlighted and wrote about was verse 16. Do you hear the alarms? There's a car alarm going off. In verse 16, I said that God hears our cries because it's talking about how God heard their cries whenever they were in Egypt. And verse 18, 20, and 21, it talks about the Edomites. And then I wrote down, remember that the Edomites are the descendants of Esau. It seems kind of obvious because Edomites, Esau, they sound like they both start with E. But some people don't know that. So if you don't know, the Edomites are descendants of Esau. And then in verse 17, before the portion about the Edomites, it says something about the King's Highway. And I said this was a major trade route extending from the Gulf of, Aqabah. I could never pronounce that, to Damascus. And then we turn the page, not yet in the video, but I'm turning the page right now. I'm almost done actually in the video, so I'm turning the page right now. Okay, so in verse 24, I related it back to Numbers 20 and 11 and through 12 because that's what it's referencing. And then in verse 28, it talks about Aaron dying on top of the mount. Okay, and then I said, once again, I referenced Romans 6:16, and I said, like Paul says, the act of sin leads to death. And then that is it for verse 20, basically. And here I am. I'm reading verse 21. This is not supposed to be in this place, but it's okay. I can make it. Anyways, since I'm at a place where I don't actually have to talk about anything right now because I finished it in the video, normally I do my study with me's during my break between Spanish and psychology. So I don't know how I'm going to do it whenever I'm online, and we're social distancing. But after social distancing is over and we're allowed to go out, I can go to the college and just sit up there and make a video. But I'm going to figure out what to do, but I'll try. I'm trying my best to make sure you have a lot to watch and listen and read so that you're not bored, you're not sitting at home and doing nothing. Oh, we're at chapter 21. Okay. Like I said, I'm going to try to make a lot of things so that you don't get bored or you don't have nothing to do. So for chapter 21, I start talking about the Valley of Zered, which is technically after the pink that I'm going to highlight, but for some reason I didn't write about the pink until after the yellow. So the Valley of Zered is a dry river valley carved by the Zered River. So that makes sense because it's the river, and when the river is dry, there's a valley. Makes sense, right? Okay, so then in 21 verses 4 through 9, I said, okay, so part of this is not related to the thing that I'm going to say afterwards. So the first part is not related to anything I'm saying afterwards. But I said throughout the Bible, snakes are used to represent evil and sin. Makes sense. Okay. Makes sense because in Genesis, the snake is in the Garden of Eden, represents evil and sin. Makes sense. And then the next part is not related to the snake part. That was just a comment on the fact that it was a snake and what snakes normally represent in the Bible. And then I said, here the Israelites sinned once again by murmuring against God and Moses. And then I said we need to avoid having this attitude because you don't want to be known as someone who complains a lot. And this is something that I personally have to work on because I'm a complainer. Like, and it's not really in a mean way. Like, I don't complain about other people. I just normally, like, I complain just to complain. Like, it's just something to do, I guess, for me. And I've been trying to work on it for a really long time. So I'm not perfect, and I'm not going to act like I am, but this is one that I wrote this specifically because this is something that I struggle with. And so if you're struggling with it too, it's okay. Like, everyone does from time to time, but it's something that we both need to work on. So then I go to verse 25. Why is my video stopped? Okay. I go to verse 25, and it says that Israel took all these cities, and Israel dwelt in the cities of the Amorites and the Heshbon, and in the villages thereof. So basically, if you're not catching on, the Israelites stuck close to water. They were traveling, in this instance, up the east side of the Dead Sea, and then they reached Heshbon. And do you hear that dog? There's a dog. And, sorry, there was a dog barking, and it got me completely off track. Okay. Exactly 25 miles to the west of Heshbon was Jericho, and that is actually the first city that they encounter when they enter the Promised Land. And if you don't remember, Jericho is the city where there were spies sent out. Israelite spies were sent out, and only 2 came back with a good report. That was Joshua and Caleb. Okay, so when the next part is verse 34, it says fear him not, and so at the top I wrote fear not, and that's because I have this habit of doing it because not last year but the year before I went through and I looked at every single instance of fear not, and I think it's something that you should really do if you're interested in it. If you're interested, basically I would pick out a phrase if you're wanting something extra to do in your reading, and I would study that phrase out, so every time you see it, write it down. Every time you see it, highlight it. And at the end, you can see how many times it's mentioned, in the context it's mentioned, and you get a really good study on those verses. So I said, overall, we have learned that God desires obedience, which makes sense because in 1 Samuel 15:22, he says that he wants obedience over sacrifice, which is when Saul decides that he doesn't need to wait on Samuel, and then he does the thing on his own, even though he wasn't supposed to. So then I said he wants us to follow his commandments, and it's a simple command, just love God and love people. It sums up the whole law. I mentioned that in a video, or not a video, I mentioned that in a post recently. So that is actually the end of verse 21, or chapter 21. And then I realized that I had a bunch of footage that I didn't know that I had, and I was like, oh, let me put this in this video. So I have footage from chapter 14 in this video, and now you understand why. It was just extra, I didn't see it. I was like, oh, there we go, I can use that. So basically, I planned on doing 20 and 21, but then I guess at some point I wanted to do 14, and I had like a couple of minutes of footage on 14, and I was like, well, I don't want that to go to waste, so I decided to add it. And now we are going to chapter 14. Okay, so this is extra footage. I highlighted verses 8 and 9, and I said, you don't have to fear, God is with you, and he will fight for you. Who can stand against you if he's for you? So I said nothing. And then in verse 11, I highlighted that one, and I said, how long will we provoke him, and how long will we err to believe him? Which is something that he mentions specifically in that verse. And then in verse 18, it mentions qualities of God, which is long-suffering, great in mercy, and forgiving. And then in verse 19, I said they have a habit of acting out, but God forgave them every time. And then in verse 20, I said, again, intercede for people, because intercessory prayer is very important, and if you're able to do it, you should definitely do it at any time. And then in verse 24, it says, my servant Caleb, because he had another spirit with him. And it wasn't that he was following another god or anything like that. It was just that he had a different type of attitude. He had a faithful spirit, and the others had a fearful spirit. So I said, do you have another spirit with you? Do you follow God and believe in him when no one else does, just like Caleb? And then the last one I said was verse 30. It said, save Caleb and Joshua, and those are the two people who remained faithful, and they weren't afraid of the people because they knew that God could fight for them. So like I said, they had another spirit with them. They were faithful while everyone else was fearful. So that's it. Actually, I lied. So for verse 31, I referenced Numbers 14 and 3 because that's what it's referencing in the verse. So I hope this makes sense, and I hope that you like it. And I'm a little out of breath, but I don't know why. But bye, thanks. Oh, there she does it.